The bottom line, when we put students in developmental education, we disproportionately place students of color and low-income students into developmental ed. That would be all well and good if students came out of developmental education, completed their gateway courses, and went on to a post-secondary credential, but unfortunately that's not the case. In fact, students of color and low-income students are less likely to make it out of developmental education and into gateway college courses. And so that really is a critical dimension of all of our college completion efforts. If we're going to close equity gaps, we have to deal with the issues of developmental education. And we have a state, California, that has looked at their own data and made that commitment through the passing of legislation and a coalition of faculty members, institutional leaders, policymakers that have committed themselves to closing equity gaps by dealing with the issue of developmental education. We're fortunate to have a great panel of folks from California that's going to talk about this. So let's welcome them here today. Jessie Ryan was with the Campaign of College Opportunity, and Jessie, working with legislators and that coalition of leaders across the state, passed through a set of legislation. And so we're going to talk with Jessie first about what happened. How was it that you were able to pull together a group of folks and develop this policy? But first, tell us a little bit more about Assembly Bill 705 and what it does and how it's going to transform success for students across the state of California.
Thank you, Bruce. I have to tell you, I think it's so appropriate that we started this conversation with a student story, because we often hear that developmental education is where college dreams go to die. I will never forget a young man from the Central Valley telling me that when he placed into Math 100 after having completed pre-calculus in high school, he said to his mother, "Math 100 is where my college dreams will go to die." And so this is really our moral compass as we try to transform our remedial education system. And there are some exciting things going on in California. After years of trying to encourage all of our stakeholders to challenge the status quo, we're finally at a place where we are making significant movement that is student-centered and an urgent set of reforms. Specifically, we are changing the way we do remediation at California community colleges. To understand AB 705, I think it's extremely important to understand the situation, the landscape of California, if you will. California's community college system are the gateway to opportunity for the vast majority of students in the state, and as you know, one of the largest student body populations in the country, with 2.3 million students accessing their post-secondary dreams at a California community college. Unfortunately, what we know is that 80% of students who enter the doors of community college will assess as needing remediation in math or English or both. And the more levels below college level, and you'll hear this from my peers, that our students place, the least likely they are going to be to make it out. And so this has truly been an issue that we have been grappling with, recognizing that we are failing our students at the start of their educational journey. AB 705 has been a transformational piece of policy meant to mandate remediation and changes at California community colleges, specifically ensuring that we are maximizing the placement of students through the doors of California community colleges into college-level math and English. We know the research supports that we will have most students across the state in a position to be successful if granted access to college-level math or English with the appropriate supports. Unfortunately, we have operated historically under a culture with a deficit mindset, where we quite often create our placement policies based on the margins, the anecdotes of students who were ill-equipped to succeed at completing college-level coursework. And yet, as my colleagues will share with you, the majority of students, given the appropriate support and access through the doors of community college to transfer-level math and English, will be much more likely to retain, successfully progress, and then complete their college goals. Specifically, AB 705 is ensuring that unless a student is highly unlikely to succeed in college-level math or English, they are granted access to that coursework. They are given the opportunity to bypass remediation unless the evidence shows otherwise in terms of their likelihood of success. And as you will hear from both Katie and John, there is a preponderance of evidence that shows that there is a small segment of students, if no students, and Katie will talk about that, that fall into that category.
So Jessie, like I started the session, talk about the power of building a coalition around this idea of closing equity gaps, and how compelling was that an argument to bring together these leaders to commit to this strategy?
So when we began this conversation in California 10 years ago, we were grappling with a culture that prized access over student success. For many in our state, it was uncomfortable to even shift the dialogue around open access institutions that our community colleges had built their livelihood around, to this laser focus on ensuring that once through the doors of community colleges, students were actually meeting their college dreams. And so what we knew we had to do was use a multi-pronged approach that included building a broad-based coalition of supporters across the state, both internal and external stakeholders, business community, civil rights community, and students, as well as illustrating through data the empirical evidence that this change was necessary. And finally, we embarked on a communications campaign using students as really the central messengers to make the case with policymakers for the necessary reforms. When we began talking about this with members of the state legislature 10 years ago, remedial education reform was not on their priorities. In fact, I'm happy to share that it was Stan Jones who began that critical conversation with members of our legislature when he joined me for visits 7 years ago to share with our President Pro Tem of the Senate, our Assembly Speaker, our Legislative Analyst's Office, and our Department of Finance the bridge to nowhere. We began at that time to make the case and build the coalition necessary to win the hearts and minds of policymakers so that they had the courage to make the necessary changes. We quickly were able to partner with the California Acceleration Project, and this took us to the next level. We used Bridge to Nowhere and a strategy of publishing op-eds across the state, working with entities like EdSource, working with the LA Times, the Chronicles, the Sacramento Bee, to reframe the narrative around student success and the civil rights issue that underplacing our students posed. When we partnered with the California Acceleration Project, we were able to largely silence detractors because what we heard consistently from members of the legislature is we are trying to change our placement policies, and we're doing that by addressing the wild, wild west of assessment reform. We knew that we had hundreds of assessment tests and hundreds of cut scores across the state of California, and there had been legislation to create a common assessment that was moving nowhere. But we were able to show through data that the assessment tests were the problem. That in fact we needed to move away from that and move towards an evidence-based approach that lifted up high school transcript and GPA as the best indicator of student success. We took that even further and we said that self-reported data from students is much better than the assessment test in being able to, in a more holistic manner, measure a student's aptitude for college-level coursework. With the California Acceleration Project as our partners, we were able to say, yes, I understand that many would like to wait for faculty buy-in across the state, but with 114 community colleges and various levels of readiness, we cannot exist in reform pockets of excellence alone. We have hundreds of thousands of students that we are failing in real time that deserve to have the courage of legislative action action to mandate the necessary changes. And when the California Acceleration Project stepped forward, we were able to say we have faculty champions who are truth tellers, who are using the data as a tool for change. We know that there are faculty that want to see these changes enacted. We just need to do the right thing and have the political will to move this forward. We were also able to publish a series of reports, the State of Higher Education for Blacks, for Latinx students, and for ONP, Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander students, that showed that this civil rights issue of placement impacted our most marginalized groups. And we had students across the state and an ambassador corps of students urging legislative action because their success deserved to be invested in. And so with this combination of factors, we were able to get a $60 million investment in the budget to lift up high impact practices, including multiple measures. When that didn't go far enough, we introduced legislation to, in fact, change our assessment and placement practices to maximize placement into college level math and English. And that is where we are today. And for California, a state that has grappled with these conversations for more than a decade, but always rested on the status quo, this is and will be transformational if implemented well.
Thanks, Jessie. So we're going to turn it over to our friend Katie, who many of you know we've worked with for many years on these important issues. And of course, the great work she's done with her colleagues in California, fellow faculty members, on laying the foundation for this in many ways, working on these issues at the ground level, at the grassroots level. So talk, Katie, a little bit more about how your work, I think, laid the foundation for this large-scale policy that now is before you.
Yeah. So I'm an English faculty member at a community college, and my partner in the California Acceleration Project is a math faculty member. And in 2010, we got clear about the problem of attrition and remediation and that it was a structural problem. And we had examples from our own campuses of accelerated pathways that were much more, where students were much more successful. And so we sort of built this grassroots mobilization effort going in a volunteer way, college by college, inviting our faculty colleagues to implement new approaches to remediation with us, create accelerated pathways where students could take a pre-stats course and then statistics, or one accelerated dev ed course and then college English. And that was radical at the time, 2010 to 2014, 15. And we were working incredibly hard to do that. It's the largest higher ed system in the nation, 114 colleges. You know, so we would have to recruit a volunteer faculty member to lead an effort locally to get new courses in place, and they'd have to fight with their colleagues, and it could be quite bruising, frankly, at times. and so we spent the first 5 or 6 years working very hard to get these accelerated pilots on the ground, and they were much more successful than traditional remediation. And we were recruiting more colleges to join on, but we learned some things around 2015-16. So number one, we started to learn from the multiple measures placement research that some of our colleagues in the state were doing, that we had failed to ask a really important question, which is, it's the students who were placed into remediation, did they actually need remediation? And what was our basis for judging that? That our state, 80% of students were placed into remediation, which is incredibly high, and we now know completely wrong. But we, you know, so that was that we hadn't been asking that. We had only been redesigning Dev Ed and not asking whether students needed it in the first place. So that was a shift we started to make around 2015-16. And then a report came out from the Public Policy Institute of California that in 2016, after we had been really killing ourselves doing grassroots mobilization for 6 years, only 10% of students in the state were enrolled in any kind of accelerated remediation, even the weak models of it. And that was sort of crushing and clarifying for us, because and we knew when we were interacting with colleagues and we were making a case, we brought them data, we showed them the problems of traditional remediation, the power of new approaches, and sometimes faculty would just cross their arms and literally say to us, we're not doing that until somebody makes us, especially in math, they would say this. And so we sort of thought, okay, I guess it's time to make you. And that is a very radical thing for me as a faculty member to say, we need legislation to tell us what to do. Because we just knew we were never going to get there. We were never, as a state, going to get where we needed to get for students if we didn't have the ability to set some common sense state policy and not just allow every college to do whatever it wants because the faculty said so. Because the faculty said it was good for students regardless of the empirical evidence that it wasn't. And so we started to work with Jessie and her colleagues at the campaign to fight for this legislation, AB 705. And that has made us unpopular with some of our colleagues, but we've been unpopular with some of our colleagues since 2010, so we're sort of used to that. The one thing that helped us is that the legislation didn't come out of nowhere. It wasn't just slapped down, so that by the time it happened in our system, we had a strong base of faculty champions that were already pushing hard for these reforms and that signed letters to the governor and that really were saying, basically we were saying, please help us do what we know is right for our students, because somebody made a joke last night, I think it was from a Shasta College faculty member, said, if the vote in your department is 99-1, it's a tie. that there's a sort of veto power that if somebody in your department doesn't want to do it, that you won't do it, you know. And so we really needed to tip the balance toward change, and AB 705 has done that. And I want to say what I think is another thing we learned is as we learned about placement and we sort of looked at our own models. The first models that we helped colleges develop were the 2-semester pathways, like an accelerated course and then the gateway course. And we now are telling people to kill those models, even though we helped them develop it in the first 5 or 6 years of our work. They're just not as powerful. So here's some data from a 2018 study by the Public Policy Institute of California. The gray is corequisite models. So the first corequisite models we developed in California in English. This is the gateway completion rate across the first 9 colleges who worked with us in 2000. This is the 2016-17 cohort year. The teal bar is when they offered a single semester remedial course that was open to any student. So it was just, the student could complete their gateway in 1 year. And you can see that it's just a lot lower than the CoREC model. And the orange is the traditional remediation in English. And in math, we had fewer early initiators of CoREC models in math, but the data are the same. It's the stark difference in completion between a co-requisite model where they bypass standalone remedial courses, go directly to the college level gateway course, and have support are just so far more powerful than even the accelerated models that we'd been working with faculty to develop. So now we're trying to kill those models across the state. And the last thing I want to say that's really powerful about AB 705 that I think is important for all of your systems is it forces this paradigm shift to where we have historically said, you have to prove you're ready. Are you ready? Are you ready for us? And if you were, whatever line you designed, whatever cut score or bar you set, the students below it were typically worse off as a result. And AB 705 forces us to change that. It says placement is about giving each student their best possible placement, the placement that's going to give them the best possible chance of completion. And we have the work of the Multiple Measures Project has helped to make that empirical rather than just, my opinion based. And so I'm going to share this slide. This is some statewide data. John's going to talk more about this, but the language of our law, how can we maximize students' chances of completing gateway courses in 1 year? This is how it breaks down empirically. So students in English who have a GPA, high school overall GPA of 2.6 or higher, if they are allowed to enroll in college English without remediation across the state of California, 79% of them succeed in the course. So those students never should have been placed into remediation. They have incredibly high pass rates if we would just get out of their way and let them take the courses they're qualified for. But if they start 1 level below the gateway course, their 1-year completion drops to 40%. So it cuts in half. If they have a GPA between 1.9 and 2.6, if they're allowed to enroll in college English, they have a 58% average success rate across our state. If they are required to begin 1 level below college English, it drops to 22%. And then if they have a GPA below 1.9, which in the statewide data is only about 10% of the student population, we don't have a lot of those students actually, but if they're allowed to enroll in college English, they have a 43% success rate. That's not great. It's certainly not what we would want, but it is a hell of a lot better than 12%, which is what happens if they start one level below. So this is the paradigm shift that we're sort of being asked to make, and I think I would invite all of you to bring back home, is to think about placement not in terms of here is the bar we set, you're ready or you're not, but that your placement should not leave a student worse off. That you are not helping, we need to like dispel the myth that we are helping them with these courses that make them worse off. And so then the last piece of the slide I want to share is what co-requisite models do in the mix around maximizing completion. So at San Diego Mesa College, they have a co-req where it's a regular 3-unit gateway course with 2 units of attached support, taught really as one big class by the same teacher. And they let everybody with below a 2.6 high school GPA into it, and the success rate for those students is 74%. So this is the change that if we implement AB 705 right, these are the kinds of gains that we can expect to see across the state of California.
Thanks, Katie. Let's shift over to John. Yes, absolutely. I mean, you do get, this is California. There are millions of students in this state that are going to be impacted by this. This is tremendous. And John, one of the other unique elements of this is how data professionals like yourself actually became leaders in this movement. You weren't just simply pushing out the data, you were having conversations and making the case. Talk about sort of how your use of data was a powerful way to get this conversation going in the state.
So, as Bruce has alluded, it's a little bit strange sometimes as a data person to be up here in these conversations. And one of the things that happened for us in California is that some of the data, for those of us who are working in those back offices everywhere, the data was just so compelling to us and so just different from everything that we expected that there was nothing that we could do except try and share it as widely as possible. So from the very beginning, when we started looking at this at Long Beach City College, one of the things we were finding is that fully half of students who are being placed into developmental education didn't belong there. Half. Right, in a state that's placing, 80% of its students into developmental education of 2.3 million students, right? So we're talking about 40% of 2.3 million. That is an enormous number of students who had the capacity to succeed in college level work, who are being denied access based on our method of assessing them. And so it's one of those things that over time, as data professionals, what we do is we spend a lot of time then following up with subsequent questions, right? So when we started the work at Long Beach, the first question everyone had was, is something special about Long Beach, right? Long Beach is different, they have a unified system, their students are different, it won't work for us, right? It won't work for us in the Inland Empire, it won't work for us in Northern California, it won't work for us in urban Los Angeles, whatever the case may be. It doesn't work, it worked there because it was different. So the first thing is, let's check other places. So we moved to the student transcript enhanced placement study, looked at colleges that were rural, urban, exurban, suburban, big, little, medium, and the same thing was happening everywhere. And then the next step was we could show people that they were misplacing folks, but then they couldn't make the step towards implementation. Like, how do we change our placement? And so the next step was to work with them on the kind of data sharing tools to make sure that people had the data necessary to do this work locally. And then what ends up happening is we start to see these paths converge between misidentifying huge numbers of students' capacity, the opportunity to get many more students into college level with appropriate support, and a state policy move that for people in the data shops was brilliant. Right, so a lot of legislation is often highly prescriptive, right? You must do it in this particular way. The brilliant part about the legislation in California was it was just basically follow the evidence, right? Here is the evidence for what predicts student performance. Use things based on the evidence to place students. That's the first part of the law. And the second part of the law is if you're going to place students in developmental education, we're not going to prescribe it in the law. We're just going to say, show us. Show us the students who will benefit from this. Which brings us to the last part of the work that the data scientists have done, which is, are there students that will benefit or be more likely to successfully complete a gateway college English or math course if they start in developmental education? And so what we did is we took all this work where we were looking at what predicts performance, and we identified the students who were least likely to succeed in a college level course. And so when you look at students, Katie mentioned one of them. In English, it's students below 1.9, somewhere around 10 to 15% of students. In statistics, it's students that are below a 2.3. It's a little bit bigger. We're getting about 25%. For a STEM pathway, like pre-calculus as a starting point, you're talking about maybe 35-40% of students are in that lowest set of students who are unlikely to succeed. If you get these students directly into a college level course and, and they take it, their success rates are very low. Right? No one would be happy with these success rates. 43% in a college level English class is a tragically low success rate. And then there's a lot of work that we did to make sure that that success rate was accurate as possible. I'm not going to get into all the statistical adjustments because no one in this audience is interested. But so we tried to make sure that we weren't cheating at all. But then the key thing is, what happens to those students if they start, the same students, right? Students who are low-performing high school students, what happens to those students if they start just one level below, right? Not 2, 3, 4, 5 levels that some of our institutions have. What if they start one level below? Their likelihood of completing the college level course is enormously lower. Enormously lower. And so what we were able to do, given the charge that we had to follow the evidence, was show that there are no students that we can identify in the state who, at least among students who have gone to high school, right, who are more likely to succeed if they start in developmental education than if they start at college level.
So, okay, let me just get back to that point. So, tell me, I mean, there's got to be a population of students that doesn't work for, right? I mean, students of color, low-income students, like, who does it not work for?
It works for everyone. Right? So one of the things, this is the types of things that we do all the time. So chase down, what are the questions that people have? Students with disabilities, students who are ELL in high school, students of color, low-income students, first-generation college students, Pell Grant recipients, extended opportunity program participants. You name the group, people have asked us, does this not work for them? It's the same for all students. It's a structural problem. Every single group that we've looked at is far more likely to succeed in a college level course if they start at that college level course, right? And so then the question becomes, no one wants a 43% success rate. Katie showed you some of the evidence in English. The other evidence is in mathematics, where you look at some of our colleges that have started on this journey in mathematics and started with Corequisite. I just want to focus on that. It's your leftmost set of students. Those are the students in the students with the lowest performance in high school, have the lowest likelihood of success in a college level course. You give them Corequisite support, and they're actually pretty likely to succeed. Those still aren't great, but compared to what would happen if they started in that course without support, it's almost double, compared to what would happen if they started one level below, their likelihood of completion is somewhere between 5 to 7 times higher, right? Starting them at college level with the appropriate support for all students is the most effective way to get students to complete college level courses.
Great, thank you, John. So this is what we call a teaser. We're going to adjourn here in a few minutes from this session, and we're going to go to the Stan Jones stage, and we're going to talk more. And in that session, we're going to obviously continue to talk about these topics, but more importantly, talk more about what's happening to support the implementation of these efforts across this tremendously large state with thousands of faculty and hundreds of institutions that we're working with. So I encourage you, if you're interested in learning more, to join us in the Stan Jones stage a little bit later today. So with that, let's give this panel a round of applause. And thank you.